Welcome everyone, Andrew here, and today we're going to talk about the granddaddy of election battles, and that is Bush versus Gore. No, it's not Trump versus Biden, but we are going to talk about what the application of Bush versus Gore has to Trump versus Biden in 2020. So let's start with the facts. George W. Bush went up against Al Gore, who was on the Democratic ticket for the 2000 election. Now, Al Gore had been the vice president to Bill Clinton, and in the preliminary polling was favored to win. But it came down to a very, very, very close election in which Florida, surprisingly, ended up tipping the scales in the favor of Bush. Now let's look at the exact details. Now in Florida, at that time, my home state had what were called vote-o-matic election machines. These election machines had paper ballots in which someone came up and punched a hole in the particular ballot in order to indicate which candidate they preferred. Now, one problem with this particular method was sometimes individuals would not punch the hole completely. And that resulted in the famous hanging Chad. Now, there was also a second type of Chad, which is called the dimpled Chad. Now, a hanging Chad is when someone would attempt to poke a hole, but the paper wouldn't completely break off. It would still attach the ballot on at least one end. Now, a dimpled Chad, or pregnant Chad, was when it looked like somebody intended to punch a hole, but they didn't get through the paper at all whatsoever. Now, these votes were not counted. And that's very important because initially, when they ran the count and when all the votes were in, initially, the votes went in favor of Bush. The state of Florida, run by Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, had their election results certified for Bush. But despite Al Gore conceding, he eventually discovered that these dimpled or pregnant Chads and all of the hanging Chads went in his favor. Therefore, he demanded a recount. Now, that demand for a recount went to the Florida Supreme Court, which sent an order back to the counties saying that they should run a recount. But at the same time, gave no instructions on how to run the recount or who should be running the recount. Therefore, you had different counties doing wildly different things. Palm Beach had one particular method in which they counted ballots, which was a little bit more restrictive. Broward County was a little bit more permissive. They were looking at more ballots when they were recounting. In Miami-Dade County, they weren't even looking at all of the precincts. They were just recounting votes from certain select precincts. So when the Bush campaign and the Republicans found out this was happening, they filed for a stay. Now, a stay is a form of injunctive relief. That is a form of equitable relief which entitles the filer to an injunction, that is to stop everything that is happening if they're able to prove that the action that would happen would cause irreparable harm, similar to a restraining order. If I was to go get a restraining order against my roommate, I would have to prove that him continuing to be my roommate and existing in close proximity would result in irreparable harm to me. So in this case, they had to prove that there would be irreparable harm if these recounts went on. Now, importantly, Justice Scalia granted that stay. Justice Scalia said, in granting of the stay, that the counting of votes that are of questionable legality does, in my view, threaten irreparable harm to George Bush and to the country by casting a cloud upon what he claims to be the legitimacy of his election. Count first and rule upon legality afterwards is not a recipe for producing election results that have the public acceptance democratic stability requires. Justice Stevens disagreed with Justice Scalia's opinion and issued a dissent in the granting of that stay, which was joined by Justice Souter and Justice Ginsburg. And in that, he said, there is a danger that a stay may cause irreparable harm to respondents, that is, Al Gore, and more importantly, the public at large. Preventing the recount from being completed will inevitably cast a cloud upon the legitimacy of the election. After the stay, the case returned to the Supreme Court, And the issue was whether or not the counting of ballots by the counties in various different methods violated the Equal Protection Clause. Now, it's important to understand the Equal Protection Clause. That's part of the 14th Amendment and says that similar parties should be treated similarly in essence. But up to this point, the Equal Protection Clause had never been used for voting rights. It had been used initially for racial segregation, sexual discrimination, sexual identification, welfare, zoning, abortion, but never something like voting rights. But in Bush versus Gore, they chose to extend the Equal Protection Clause to apply to voting rights and saying that voters must be treated similarly. And therefore, if there was going to be a recount, it had to happen in the exact same method throughout the state. Now, at that time, there wasn't enough time to go through the recount process before the election results had to be certified to the Electoral College in December. And therefore, when they issued their ruling on December 12th, Al Gore conceded. It was not possible for him to have a recount that would potentially go in his favor, and thus ended the saga of Bush versus Gore. Now, how does this apply today? So today, we see multiple claims fired in multiple venues, different states, localities, which say that certain voters were treated different than others. Now, once again, we need to understand that a complaint is not something that bears evidence. A complaint is merely an allegation. Now in Florida, sometimes a complaint will include a copy of a contract, if it's required to include a contract, but you wouldn't include stuff like expert testimony, statistical analysis, or affidavits, which are the type of evidence that is required in court to prove these claims. So here we have, in 2020, Donald Trump challenging the vote on equal protection clauses, not in just one state, but many. And not only would he have to prevail in one state, such as Al Gore attempted to do in Florida, but he would have to prevail in multiple states in order to come out ahead. Another big difference is that what was trying to happen in 2000 was for a recount to go forward. But here that's not the case. Donald Trump is indeed the one that wants the recount. Instead, he's seeking for votes to be discarded or removed. And that's simply not the same factual pattern as Bush versus Gore. If the courts are to rule in 2020 on this issue, they might look for some guidance to Bush versus Gore, but the fact pattern is not similar. They can't tie them one-to-one together, which could give them a basis to deny Mr. Trump's legal claims. And we have indeed seen them being denied in certain venues. So as we watch this going forward, we should be very mindful that these cases can potentially start legal precedents, such as happened with Bush versus Gore, despite the fact that the election results may ultimately come out the same. Now, if you enjoyed this content, please like, comment, subscribe. Leave me comments down below if you think something different, or if you'd like to give me some comments on this particular topic. But until next time, this episode is adjourned.